Manfred Zadik, who emigrated from Germany to Guatemala, then Guatemala to Berkeley, California. And in Berkeley, he dedicated the rest of his life as an attorney to arranging restitution for displaced Jews. And he would frequently travel back and forth to Germany to visit with people. And the favorite story I have is at one point he saw in the window of a pawn shop a pair of beautiful silver candlesticks. And as was the tradition, on the bottom every family would engrave their initials under the felt. And he went into the pawn shop and peeled the felt off the back of these candlesticks and said, "See, MF, Manfred Zadik, these are mine." He took them and walked from the pawn shop and not paid for them, and said, "These belong to our family. You guys took them. They're coming home with me." And I thought that was a wonderful story, and I remember that very, very well.
Who did this?
My grandfather, Manfred.
Your grandfather, Manfred?
Manfred. So.
And where was they?
Somewhere in Germany, I don't remember, where he went traveling, probably back to Hamburg, where they came from, and he frequently went back and forth to negotiate, to do things, and to work on restitution for the displaced Jews in Northern California. And he didn't work for a company, he worked for himself, and people paid him what they felt it was worth. Nellie Bondi was his wife, and Nellie was another good story. Nellie was a very impatient woman, and she didn't like formality, and we would do the Seder, and it was a lengthy supper, and she would stand behind him and tap her foot and say, "Manfred, dinner will be getting cold. Manfred, dinner will be getting cold." And they were an interesting couple. Manfred had 3 sons, Walter, Frank, and Michael, or Hansel.
Okay.
Frank's son is Tom. Michael's son is Andrew and Nicholas, and Judith is a daughter. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Good. Cool. Thank you.
What about Walter's children?
Walter's had 2 boys. Only one is alive, and that's Mark, who's married with 3 children.
And where are
In
they?
Britain. They live in England as well.
I got into the Zadik family by marrying Erwin, whose father was Bruno, and his father, I think, was Benno. Right. So I know a few of the relatives who lived in Breslau. I knew, for example, one of Bruno's sisters, Fanny Kober, but she, I think, perished in the Holocaust. And I knew, of course, the Zuckers. I knew, and the children of the Zuckers. As a matter of fact, my daughter was a bridesmaid at Miriam's and John's wedding.
Flower girl.
Flower girl. Yeah, flower girl, not a bridesmaid. I'm sorry. She was only 5 years old. So, and as you know, Benno, who was the brother of my father, also died. And where his parents died, we never knew. We don't know where they were shipped to. The only thing I know that my aunt, who was at that time still in Germany, wrote us in a Red Cross message that they were shipped to a Kloster Grüssau, which apparently was some kind of camp from where people were transported further east. So, you know, I just told Ovid, which came to my mind just today for the first time, that Hermann Zadik, who had emigrated already a long time ago, and he had a rare bookshop in New York. And when we got married in September 1938, my parents, my father and my stepmother, were not in Germany anymore, and they celebrated our wedding day with this Hermann Zadik. You see, in Crystal Night, you know, like when all the Jews were, many Jews were kind of picked off wherever they were and shipped to Buchenwald. Erwin was, also taken, and I immediately went to the steamship company and bought tickets for Shanghai, because that was the only way where you could go without a visa, without money, without any formalities except the steamship ticket. You know, we were registered to come to the United States, but our quota number wasn't due yet, so I didn't want to wait, and I went to the Gestapo, and they let him out after about 6 weeks from Buchenwald, and then we left in February for Shanghai.
Spring, sprinderlich, spring. unser Ohr im Städtel nebach brennt. Beise Winden mit ihr Gossen reißen, brechen und zerblossen, starke noch die wilde Flammen, als darum schon brennt. Und ihr steht und guckt so sich mit verlegten Händen. Und ihr steht und guckt so sich, unser Städtel brennt.
In the meantime, you know, after Erwin was arrested and shipped to Buchenwald, I was arrested myself, but not for being Jewish, but because my sister and I, when we were younger, when we were teenagers, we had been going to Czechoslovakia very often and smuggling newspapers in ski poles, you know, that were printed on this very thin paper, and they were anti-Hitler papers, and we gave them then to people in Breslau. And my sister was caught handing over one of these papers to a guy, and she was arrested and tried for high treason. And I was connected, because I was very often with her, I was arrested too, and we were both tried in January 1939 at the People's Court in Berlin, and my sister got a sentence of 3.5 years in prison, and I was acquitted, and even though I was acquitted, I was taken to Berlin Alexanderplatz, which was a Gestapo prison, where Erwin, who had come out of Buchenwald in the meantime, showed that we were leaving. So after 10 days in Alexanderplatz, I was released too, and then we luckily were able to leave for Shanghai. And my big luck was that when I bought the tickets for Shanghai, that I only could get them for February, because if I would have gotten them before the trial, they wouldn't have let me go. So I was lucky in this way. And my sister, unfortunately, did not make it, because after her sentence of 3.5 years was up, she was taken to Ravensbrück, where she died half a year later. The trip on the boat was to Shanghai was quite interesting. It was a German boat, and I still have the notice of the captain, who said to all to all Jewish passengers to use the writing room only and not the smoking room, and the swimming pool only, and this time. And I remember there was one very high German guy who wanted to show that he disagreed with it. He purposely went swimming when it was time for the Jews to go swimming. But I don't think it was the captain himself who was so disgusting with this, but there were some very high Nazi officials who went on the same boat to Japan, and they made him do it. And the stewards, as a matter of fact, were very nice. They gave us lots to eat and double portions, because once you get there, you won't have the money to eat so much. So it was actually, you know, we were young, and we were both out of prison, and it was a very nice trip. And coming to Shanghai, then we were welcomed by the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, who had set up camps, you know, dormitories and soup kitchens, and they took us there because, you know, we had no money, as everybody at that time went out of Germany. They could only 10 marks, which was $4. And, you know, it was not easy in Shanghai, but first of all, we were young, and second, you know, we could sell tablecloths and shoes and suits and whatever little jewelry we had, and cameras, whatever we had, we could sell. And then after the war was over, my father, who had been already in the United States, was able to send us money. So then, by that time anyway, I had a job for the American Army, because when the war was over and the American Army came to Shanghai, they sent their GIs home as soon as possible, and they took civilian employees who did the work that they normally would do, mostly office work. And I worked there, and I had the first time in Shanghai that I had a half a decent salary. So I have written a whole story about Shanghai and the whole group of people who were there. There were about 20,000 refugees from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, and about 20,000 of us. And the Japanese, when they took over all of Shanghai after Pearl Harbor, they made us eventually move into a certain area. All the stateless refugees had to move into that area. And we had to, if somebody still had a job outside, they had to get a special permission, which they had to show to Japanese sentries when you left the district. This district was eventually known as the Shanghai Ghetto. But I have to say that the Japanese didn't treat us all that badly. But they treated the Chinese, terribly. And even, after Pearl Harbor, when they interned the British and American subjects, they were put to camps and they were treated much worse. They had, really a starvation diet, and also abused in other ways. So we were fairly lucky in Shanghai, but how lucky we were, we only learned after the war was over. And when we learned about what was going on in Europe, which we had no way of knowing, we didn't even know how the war was going or anything. We didn't know about the atom bomb either. So we only knew that the war was over, and all of a sudden all the Japanese sentries disappeared from the street, and then eventually we learned the whole story.
Muti, my eldest Zadik, went to Guatemala through Ellis Island in a boat with her uncle back in 1905, I think. That was 1905. And I think she remained in Guatemala from that age. She was like 15 years old. So from that time, my grandmother lived in Guatemala, and at that time, I think Manfred was living there also, and Percy, and I think Ferdinand also was living there. Elsa Zadik stayed in Guatemala. She survived with working with this factory, chocolate factory, and I think the factory at some point broke. Maybe could be before she left to Colombia in the 60s. But I recall that my father said that Manfred took care of her well-being economically from when she lost her husband, my grandfather. She never was a good administrator of this factory. For any reason, the factory also had problems with fire and burnout, and it was difficult for her to get the finances okay. So Manfred took care of her well-being for many, many years. And I recall Manfred writing many letters, and Nelly Bondi also writing many letters to my grandmother in Cali, because I took care of mail sometimes, and I saw his name many times. She was maybe very connected with letters with that side of the family, but I think she wrote also for other Zadiks that remained in Guatemala. There was, for example, Byron Zadik still having a very important lithography in Guatemala. I think that lithography is still there, but it's not the Zadik anymore. But it's still a Zadik. You can see it. Yeah, the Lithografía Zadik. And it's one of the most important lithographies in Guatemala. But I think there are still some Zadiks in Guatemala now. And my father told me, and this was before I came here, I called here to Cali and I asked him, well, what do you know about your family? And he said, well, I know that Percy married a Mexican lady whose name is Carmen, and I have to find out a little bit more about that side. But and he said that they have more family there in Mexico.
Thank you. And
I certify that this is true.
Yeah. My from my mother's side, she was already sixth generation, born in Israel, and my father came from, excuse me, from Germany. He was born in Guatemala. His father, Martin, was he had an industrial factory for sweets in Guatemala, and he died. He was sent back when he was very sick, back to Germany. And my grandmother was left with two boys. The youngest one was Bert, Ernesto's father, and the eldest one was Rudy, my father. And that's why they sent him, because he was the eldest one, back to Germany. She couldn't afford to raise him, and he was sent, I think, to Manfred.
Yes.
And Manfred took him and took care of his wealth, of his school education. And later on, he decided to leave to Israel. And that's the way that our two families, even though that they were only two brothers, were separated to two ends of the world.
When did he go to Israel?
I'm not sure, but we thought yesterday, we tried to calculate it. I think it was 1938, 40, something like that. And he met my mother, and I'm an only child, and I have two children and two grandchildren. That's it.
So my great-grandparents were Ferdinand and Regina. I guess I didn't know until I got documents from other people. Ferdinand seems to have been rather infamous, very, very wealthy, and also very eccentric. Yes.
In what way?
Well, the stories say that he would visit your house, and if he liked something you had, he would simply take it. And the only thing I can imagine is that that people didn't want to end up being disinherited from his will, because they seem to have allowed him to do this. And he was also very involved with the business in Guatemala. And then my grandparents were Herta Zadik. Ferdinand had they had three children: Herta, Pelham, who is Susanna's grandfather, and Lydia. And Lydia seems to have been, what they called it was feeble-minded. And my mother always said that was because first cousins had married. Because Ferdinand and Regina were actually not first cousins. He seems to have cradle-robbed, and she was the daughter of his first cousin. But in any case, Lydia was killed. She was arrested very early and killed for being mentally defective. But my grandfather, Cesar, was a very prominent physician in Hamburg. He specialized in venereal diseases, and since it was a port city, he had a lot of business from the sailors who came in. And my grandmother seems to have specialized in playing bridge and dressing well. My mother was not very fond of her mother and used to say the only thing she was good at was playing bridge and being stupid. Who knows, but sometimes I think we forget the fact that the Holocaust is in the family doesn't mean that people weren't also quite crazy in their own right and didn't have all kinds of other problems aside from that. But my grandmother died quite young. My mother had moved out and gone to Berlin as an art student. And she was part of Hashomer Hatzair and was planning to move to Israel. But then my grandfather was arrested. He had applied for papers to go to Guatemala. And since he had a great deal of money, they wanted to make sure that they got it all. And the charges against him, last year I finally got a microfilm from Hamburg, from the state archives, and got about 250 pages of the records. That all Jews had to file complete inventories, which they had to pay for, to have people come to the house and inventory, and I mean everything. Every pair of socks, toothbrush, everything is on these lists. All of the silver was assayed and gold and all of the rugs, and so I have all of that. And they accused him of misrepresenting the income he got from Guatemala, that he wasn't declaring everything that he got from, I think, from Julio Zadik. So they put him in prison. And what was lucky was that he had treated the warden of the prison as a patient. So my mother came back from Berlin and was allowed to bring him food every day to the prison. And then there are all of these letters from, it was a catch-22 because they wouldn't allow him out of prison until they had the records proving that he wasn't concealing anything, but he couldn't get the records while he was in prison. So there are all of these letters from Manfred. There's a fascinating period of letters where they're saying his health is suffering. They offer to pay for the services of a policeman to accompany him if they'll just release him for a few days so that he can go and do the research. And first the prison authorities say yes, and then they finally say no. But eventually they did release him, and there are these letters saying that he seems not to have misrepresented as badly as we thought in any case. So they let him out so that they could get all of the money. And then in these records is also, now I don't speak or read German, but I knew what this letter was when I saw it. They then sent him a bill for his incarceration. So my mother then sold a lot of the family possessions. This is all the end of 1939 that this is going on. And my mother sold a lot of the family artwork and jewelry and stuff, and paid for a taxi to take him from Hamburg to Amsterdam. And the deal was that when he arrived in Amsterdam safely, the banks would release, because he had accounts in Amsterdam, they would release everything to the Nazis. So they did. He made it to Amsterdam and went from there to Guatemala. She never saw him again. She waited another 6 months until her number came up. So she then went on a train, a closed train, from Hamburg to Paris, from Paris to Lisbon. This was all arranged by the Joint Distribution Committee. And in Lisbon, she got on a Portuguese freighter, the Nyassa, and on June 13th, 1941, she landed in New York. My grandfather died before I was born. I never met him. And then he remarried Elena Zadik, who was in Guatemala and who was a cousin of my grandmother. The other thing that was fascinating was, I couldn't remember the name of the ship. My mother told me when I was a child, and when I wanted to get those records, I called the Joint Distribution Committee. And they first said to me, you know, there weren't ships coming that late, you must have it wrong. But I really remembered 1941, and they said, well, there's so few that came in then, we'd have them in the records for sure, and we don't find her. And a month later, the woman called, she said, I'm in a warehouse in Brooklyn where we keep old records, and I remembered your mother, and so I have actually press clippings from the boat landing and the ship's record from my mother, and there were some very important rabbis apparently on that ship, and the New York Post wrote it up, and they made it sound as if it was a pleasure cruise. You know, so and so many, you know, citizens from Hamburg disembarked, and most of them were Jewish, and, you know, Frau so-and-so claims the food was very good on board, and, I mean, there was no this is 1941, it could have been a pleasure cruise landing. There's no, I mean, it really says something about what was going on in America at the time.
My father, Frank, left as early as 1934 when he was a student studying medicine, and the Nuremberg laws came out saying that Jewish doctors weren't going to be able to practice properly. So as soon as he could, he came over to this country. And at that point, by himself. And finished his medical schooling first in Oxford and then in Sheffield, where he met my mother, who had also come over from Germany. But that's another story. But the interesting thing is that I'm not sure when Michael and Walter came over, but just before the war, I think. So the three brothers were all in Britain. There was a great scare in this country, and everybody with German nationality was rounded up and put into camps. Many people were put onto the Isle of Man, where, you know, which was at the time said to be one of the best universities in Europe. I think the Amadeus String Quartet met there. My father and Walter, and I don't know about Michael. Let's see, a ship. Some of them were shipped over to Canada. I think some. One ship was sunk. My father was on the next one with Walter. I don't know about Michael. Not Michael. Canada. To Canada.
They were deported?
They were deported and kept in a fairly loose prison camp, internment camp in Canada. They divided the Nazis from the rest. They just about worked out that not all Germans were Nazis, but by that time. But it took they couldn't. It took my mother getting my father a job really before they let him out. So the British were not entirely free from blame of this sort of thing. Later on, all three of them managed to join the British forces. My father as a doctor, and he spent 2 years in West Africa and landed up in Burma just as the war ended. Walter, the middle brother, became a commando and went across on D-Day, and shortly after that was captured. Now, Walter and Michael changed their names from Zadik to Thompson and kept that name. My father changed his name to Young, but changed it back again. So they had Walter Thompson had to look completely innocent and not understand what was happening when people were, when his, the interrogators were saying, he doesn't know anything, let's kill him. But he did...
He pretended not to speak German.
Yes, he had to, because if they'd realized who he was, he wouldn't have lasted a minute. Anyway, actually I owe quite a lot to Walter, because he came back to, well, first be a teacher and then he studied psychology and became a clinical psychologist and actually gave me my first job. So I got my first job as a clinical psychologist through nepotism. Anyway, that's enough.
I don't know if, first of all, I don't know if anyone made a map from the area where actually our, let's say, our forefathers originated from, because it's a relative small area. The same little towns are mentioned over and over again. So if there is a librarian here by any chance, I mean, you have to go back to the maps before the First World War, because part of it then became Polish. But we hear Ostrowo, Aldenau, Kempten, and few more places. It would be nice if we'll all have a map and know we all come from this little spot. Secondly, I want to add Guatemala. One of my grandmother's brothers went to Guatemala. His name was Moritz, and unfortunately for him, he chose really not a good business. He had a store. He imported China to Guatemala. So as you all know, there are a lot of earthquakes in Guatemala. And at one point, the whole crockery went. So he wrote to his mother, Charlotte Schlesinger Zadik, who was an astute businesswoman, and she had to finance him to open another China store in Guatemala. So at least someone made some money there. I hope that one of you has a picture maybe of this Moritz Zadik, because I have a picture, but I don't know. There are two brothers and I don't know who is who. How did this family tree came about? My father felt after he retired that he would like us and our descendants to know really from where did we come from? Who are our forefathers? And I repeated what he said, so you should know we didn't come from gypsies, his words. So he started first with the side of his mother's family, and then he did the Tzadik's family, which is the side of my mother's family. And when he was asked why did he do this family and not on the father's side, he said, well, these stories are so much more interesting. These were interesting families. My mother was a born storyteller. We could hear the same story many times, and there was always something new there that we didn't hear before. And it was very important for her, the family. We used to kid her and said, yes, you don't have any doctor's title, but in Mishpochology, you do have it. And so it was. My mother had the stories, my father did the research, and this wonderful collaboration, which was the way their marriage was, is really the result, I think, that we are all here. And I think they would have loved seeing all of us together.
If there is any story to be told, it's, for us at least, my sister and me, the story of our parents. As my sister said, the writing of the tree was because my father felt that Judaism, as it was in the 1970s in the United States in particular, was disappearing. Most of the people of marrying age decided not to have children, didn't get married. Many of them became munis and the various proselytizing organizations that were going around, the Krishnas, etc., were sucking a lot of kids away, and many of them didn't even know what Judaism is all about. And so he said, here our generation, which means his generation, struggled so hard to survive the Holocaust, and now the children are basically losing, and the Holocaust being Jewish, of course, and now where you can be a Jew, so many of them completely are losing all contact with it. So that was at the same time that the story Roots, which is a story of black heritage and the roots of most of you probably have heard about the story Roots and the movies that were made of it. It became very popular, and many people started searching the roots, so it was the right time. So he said, let's tell the roots of our family. And besides the fact that the Zadik and the Bernard, which are the two mother side of my father and mother stories being more interesting, as my sister said, they were also by far much more elaborate. So my father decided to do all four, but he knew he didn't have much to live. And he completed the Bernhard story completely with the stories associated with the tree itself. He did, which is his mother's side, he did the Zadik, but as all of you have gotten in the family the book of just the tree, the actual stories that came with it, which in the meantime Eva has attached to the more up-to-date tree that she has put together, has the stories that he wasn't able to include at the time because he died before it. He realized he didn't have much time, so he left that part, and it took all the time, another 30 years basically, to attach that story. Let me tell you a little bit about that side of the story. My mother, whose mother was a tzaddik, of course, Marie Tzaddik Hirsch, they lived in what is called West Preußen, which is a Polish corridor. That is the area that was ceded to Poland at the end of World War I, the Versailles Treaty, which meant that all the people who lived in this area had to move back into the rest of Germany, and in our family case it was Breslau, basically. That is where many of the forefathers of everybody sitting here actually came from, Breslau and the environment around it. Her two brothers, she lost her father in 1919 when she was 15, our mother did. And that, you can imagine, was very traumatic, and immediately after having to leave the place where you live and become refugees. Her two brothers who were soldiers in World War I, and the older one was an officer, because of that they were able to get free education and very quickly moved up, became quite well-to-do, one a doctor, one a lawyer. And the result was they spoiled their little sister, our mother, to death, and she has enjoyed all the wonderful part of Germany of the 1920s, the operas and the cabarets and the plays and you name it. And that was a story that our mother told us, all the wonderful side of that era, very little of the negative side. As it turned out, by the time, by the early 30s, my father and mother got married. Our father became, you have to realize, German Jews, irrespective of being able to go to the university, certain jobs were not typically Jewish jobs. Lawyers were Jews, but judges were not. Our father decided to become a judge. Why? Because one of his professors said, now Jews can finally get the proper place also in working for the government. That was 1932. In 1933, Hitler comes, and the first act was to throw all the German Jews, all the judges out of the courts and any other government employees the same way. As a judge being thrown out of court, can you imagine? The Nazis came into the court and bodily threw, and some of them were not so young and got very badly injured. That day, according to, I remember him telling me, he says, I decided a second-class citizen, I will not be in Germany. And I decided immediately, these are his words, to go. And I decided to go as far as I can. He wanted to emigrate to Australia. His parents, our grandparents, were farmers. And people who are attached to farms, and very few Jews owned farms, but our grandparents had a very beautiful farm where the whole family usually congregated around. People don't leave land, and they said, we'll never see you again. So our parents, immediately after getting married, went to Italy, in 1933 to Italy. The first job my father got was as a stevedore in the harbor, and after carrying heavy weights for God knows how long, he realized that's not the job for him, and eventually became a salesman for Springs. At the same time, the family in Germany, who were doing quite well, and particularly the brothers of our mother, Walter and Herbert Hirsch, one a lawyer, one a doctor, said, how can you treat our sister this way, subjecting her to this kind of life in Italy? And that's hard. My father said, with 5 pennies in my pocket in Italy, I'm a gentleman. In Germany, I'm not. You can't imagine the pressure the family put on him on returning to Germany and earn a decent living and be respectable money side. But in doing this kind of thing in Italy that was 1933, 1934, was quite something. And they, in fact, stayed in Italy until 1939. And as that story goes, the brother of my mother, the older one, Walter, 6 children, he refused to go. And we can understand some of it a little bit. One of his colleagues and friend from World War I, from the war, was somebody by the name of, that some of you will remember. His name was Stauffenberg. Stauffenberg was the one who actually put the suitcase and the bomb under Hitler's desk in 1944, trying to assassinate Hitler. Stauffenberg told our uncle, don't go. We'll get rid of this house painter, Hitler, in due time. And indeed, he stayed and stayed. Eventually, he sent all his belongings out of Germany, and he was going to board the last ship leaving Germany with his family. That ship never sailed. And he ended up first of all, transported to Ghetto Lodge, where his wife and 3 children out of the 5 died, and the last 2 of the 6 children, right? And the last, and the last 3 and the husband were eventually transported to Auschwitz, and that part. We know meticulously the story of what happened to that family, because the woman who lived, the family who lived right next door to them in Ghetto Lodge all the way to 1944, survived and wrote her entire story. So our parents talked to them. So here is one side of the family that completely disappeared, considered itself great German patriots, etc., and then ending up like this. My father, who in 1933, on basically a fundamental insult of what is right, what is fundamentally right, being a full-fledged citizen, left and decided to become a stevedore. These are 2 such opposite stories that probably are repeated in this family many, many times. In any case, while being stuck in Italy in 1938, my mother got pregnant with me, and something she never forgave herself. Took many, many years before I found out. They tried to get an abortion, which didn't succeed. So my mother felt guilty all her life for trying to abort me, which obviously I couldn't care one way or another about that. They needed.
Always a failure.
I was always, yeah, that's right. In fact, when I was born, I ended up with a big splotch on my face and 2 horns, and my mother realized it must have been the attempted abortion, which did that. But in any case, here they are in Italy, and and trying to get out. By that time, it's 1939. Hitler made a pact with Mussolini to return all the German Jews to Germany. And most of the South American visa sources disappeared. And the Vatican offered a Vatican visa if our parents would convert, or anybody for that matter, any Jew would convert. My father refused. After that, at that very time, the brother of my mother, not Walter, but Herbert, was in the concentration camp, and my father got a visa to Israel through his uncle, and they passed that visa on to the uncle who was in the concentration camp after the Kristallnacht, so he could make it to Israel. So here were our parents in Italy now with no visa. And at the last moment, they got a tourist visa for 4 weeks to Israel. Can you imagine a tourist visa? And in end of March, they came to Israel. Because I was born in end of March 1939. And a tourist visa to Israel for Palestine at the time, of course, Palestine, right? In any case, so there they arrived. I was born June 24, and my mother got so sick that they couldn't travel. She ended up being hospitalized, and the British kindly enough extended the visa for another month or two. And it was extended to September 1, World War II started, no more ships on the ocean, and now the British had to extend it for a year, and then another year, and another year, and that's how, in fact, after a while, they didn't bother him anymore. The British eventually, in fact, by 1946, there were so many illegal people in Israel already, so they just ignored the whole thing. But that's really the story of our parents, and it was our mother's retelling of it all, that all of you will get a copy of that, of the stories associated with all the names of the Zadik families whenever we'll send around, whenever the thing is ready, you'll be able to read a little bit. But all these stories came from the head of our mother, her memory through this entire period.
Now, I am here as a result of the services of my grandfather, Percy Zadik. Now, I must say from the start, with the names, there's a problem because there were several under each name, and I don't remember very well who is who and what year was what. And in any case, my grandfather was called Percy Zadik, and he was one of the 3 contributors of the clan to Israel, because as it is being discovered now, as in recent times, as a result of the blessed task that Eva has done, there have been various fractions in Israel who knew very little about each other. And now that can be explained because, unlike all you Americans here, Israel is a very big place. Yes, so, and for instance, Ariela, we come not just from Haifa, we come from Mount Carmel, and so does she, but she lived on the wrong place of Mount Carmel. She lived 2 bus stations away from the Merkaz, the center, and that didn't count. So I discovered this year, after Eva disclosed, I discovered Ariela. I will tell the story backwards. He died in 76 on his 90th birthday, having worked to his last day. He was one of the most prominent doctors in Israel, and was known to get people well alone by being seen by him. Everybody who knew him reported that just seeing him got them better. When people would come to him and say, well, when I bend down like that and do that and cough, then I have some pain in my left knee. So he will tell them, then don't do that and cough. He was also one of the first cancer researchers in Israel, and he started this whole concept of breast cancer testing stations, single-handed at first, except that you have reports that your father once asked Percy whether he could also come and help. And my grandfather told him, yes, but you're not allowed to choose who. In any case, as I already mentioned yesterday, this grandfather, he is also essentially the inventor of the sense of humor, for sure. Now, he and his wife, that's a separate story that well warrants
another meeting.
Yeah, I will mention it very briefly because it's quite extraordinary. She was born in Russia, and at the age of 15 she was already in prison for socialist activities. 6 months later she was released under some amnesty on the condition that she...
Whose school are we talking about?
Pardon?
What's her name?
Rebecca Zadik. Jacobson. And for socialist activities, and that fitted in with the sum total of the sense of humor between my grandparents exceeded any family, but she had none. So you can imagine how much my grandfather had. So she, 6 months later, she was released on the condition that she leaves the Soviet Union, Russia at the time, so that the 16-year-old girl won't overthrow the Tsarist regime. And she was sent to some relatives that they had in Germany, in Breslau, and that was the town in which my father then didn't live, but he was... Pardon? Your grandfather. Yeah, my grandfather, but was a medical student there.
Because he was a medical student in Breslau.
Yeah. They then lived already in Hamburg, and when he was ready to go and study medicine, he went on a train to, I think to Freiburg, I don't know, and on the train he met some doctor who told him that if he really wants to go to a good place, he should go to Breslau. So he changed the ticket en route and went to Breslau. That's how he was. And which was very fortunate for you, because you wouldn't hear the story because I wouldn't exist. Because there he was called upon by people who, my grandmother's family, who knew some friends of his, to come and calm down a wild Russian girl who has just arrived from Russia and is continuing her demonstrations there. And yeah, and she was 16 then, and he did come and calmed her down somewhat, and the result. By the way, she, by the age of 20, was the first woman to get a PhD in law in Germany, by the age of 20. Now, they then lived in Hamburg and came to Israel in February 39, but not out of stupidity. They stayed there till the absolute last moment, which was possible for him because he was already there, a very prominent doctor. They stayed absolutely as late as they could to try to talk every Jew who was still there into leaving. And there are many Jews all over the world who owe their life for and my grandmother was involved in training programs for Jewish youth to get some vocation so that they could work when they come to Israel, metal workers. And one problem was that in the end they gave her as a present a metal bed that they made. And that thing was in the family until not long ago. There was a big problem because the thing weighed nearly a ton. And bringing it to Israel, that was something, because the lorry that carried it overturned at the turn. Anyway.
But the bed survived.
The bed survived. The bed will survive anything. So that is how they got to Israel. But the following story, I have, first of all, my grandfather told it to me, and he told it to me in a serious way, and I always knew when he was joking, which was usually, but when he was serious, because he could be very serious. And what he told me was the following. There was one Zadik, which probably only Oved has the greatest chance of knowing correctly what his name is. But I think it's either Abraham or, well, let's call him Zadik the First. Just as a... And he went from, he was told in Germany that the place is Canada. So the tzaddiks always were no nonsense people. They heard, they did. And so he took his family, put on a ship, and they went to Canada. And Canada was, yes, it was quite nice. But he was told that really the place is Brazil. Quite a great place. We've just come back from there. So, no nonsense man. He went to check out Brazil. But he left his, he didn't want to ruin his family in the process, so he left them and parked them in Canada and went on his own to Brazil to check out whether it's really the place. And indeed he found that it is. So he went back to collect the family. But on the way back, the ship that he was going in sank. And everybody drowned except for him and the captain. And the captain survived except for one leg. He lost a leg in the process. And they were somehow, they landed on a small island, probably somewhere in the Caribbean, must be. And they were looked after by the local Indians for 6 months till the captain was well enough to move on. And then the Indians brought them to the next mainland, or the nearest mainland that they found, and that was Guatemala.
Maybe you've seen or read the story by Traven, who wrote The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. He wrote also Las Carreteras, which is these big wagons with this huge wheels, and with a pair of oxen they would go through the mountains, and that's the way his coffin was brought back to Guatemala, and that's where he was buried. Some of the generations after your grandfather were kind of shipped off to Guatemala when they had maybe a little affair with a girl they shouldn't have had, and some other things, and this way they got them out of the country.
That was a fun place.
Yeah, so that's what I wanted to add.
The synagogue in Kempen was built in 1797. It was a beautiful building which was declared national landmark by the Polish government after 1920. The Torah shrine had a special feature. When the doors of the shrine were opened, doves flew out of the opening above the shrine and went back when the doors were closed. The Jews of Kempen were very proud of their mikveh, a ritual bath which had all modern bathing, really 1797, bathing facilities. It had been donated by the brothers Stahl, who had emigrated from Kempen to Guatemala. And that was 1797. So Kempen had a connection with Guatemala. People went there. And that is how our forefathers also ended up there. Of great renown were the Kempen klezmorim, the musicians who had played before Kaiser Wilhelm. This guild of musicians had still 26 members by the year 1864. And then it goes into the children of Abraham and Marie Zadik and the rest of them. And if you read the stories, then you see how the members who went to Guatemala and etc. and who didn't. And if we bring together all the stories from all the sides, then I think we'll close the puzzle and have the whole pieces put together.
All contradict each other.
No, they don't contradict. Unless you work at it, then they'll contradict each other. It must have been a place where, from that area, people went to as the next, you go to America, you go to South America, you go to Guatemala. One of the funny stories that is not written there, but our mother told, I have to tell this story, is that one of those tzaddiks ended up being maintained by the town's madam. She had a brothel and very successful, and he wasn't able to support himself in any way, so he was her husband. So this is one of our Guatemalan ancestry.
I'm Michael. I'm from page 5. I'll go back. Some of you weren't at the restaurant yesterday, so I'll tell a little bit about what Miriam had put together and mentioned last night. Okay, there was Perez Zadik, who was the ultimate patriarch, and he had some children, and one of the children was Abraham. Abraham married Marie Kaminsky. Marie Kaminsky and Abraham were very religious and very successful. They had a linen shop, and back in those days when women were married, they came to their husband's house with a full chest of sheets, towels, dish towels, linens, and this Abraham Zadik and Marie Zadik had a very successful linen shop, and they sold to, like you said, the Polish gentry, a very successful shop. They had 4 children, I think 3 sons and 1 daughter, Ernestine, Benno, Simon, and Samuel. 2 of the sons, I think Benno and Samuel, did not continue with the family business, and they went into the lumber business. Anytime I'm incorrect, Miriam, please jump in. So Samuel, my ancestor is Samuel. He had a lumber business, and he had a son named Leo Zadik. So Leo Zadik had the lumber business, and in addition to the lumber business, to provide lumber, they had land in Poland, where they got their lumber from. Leo had 2 daughters, Margot Zadik and Ruth Zadik. They were born in 1904. Oh, let me go back. I'll tell the Torah story real fast also. Marie Zadik and Abraham Zadik were very religious, and they felt it was very important that the family have its own Torah. So in 1840, Marie hired a person, a holy scribe, to make a Torah for the Zadik family. This was 1840. This scribe, Marie Zadik, was a very pious woman. She helped many people. I think Miriam just told her about quite a bit. She housed this scribe for 2 years in her house while he made this Torah. And this Torah went to Charlotte. Let's see, Miriam. The Torah went from Abraham and Marie to...
Charlotte was the daughter-in-law,
yes. Charlotte. And Charlotte's daughter was Marie. Right, okay. Anyway, so there was this Torah in the family from 1840. Okay, I'll come back to that in a minute. Leo Zadik had 2 girls, Margot and Ruth, and Margot is my grandmother. They were quite spoiled. They had the very nice life of upper middle class German Jewish families. Margot eventually met my grandfather, who was Martin. Martin Zellner was a doctor. He was, I believe Ilan was saying your ancestor was going to be a doctor. He studied in Breslau. He was going to go to Freiburg first, and then he changed his mind and went to Breslau. I think my grandfather actually got his medical degree in Freiburg, I believe. I'm not sure. Anyway, going on the Margot Zadik side, my grandfather was your quintessential country doctor. They lived near Breslau in a town near the Czechoslovakian border called Landeshut. All his patients were Christians. And usually, sometimes the story goes is that they would pay him in chickens, not pigs, chickens and other produce, and he was your country doctor. Well, then the Nuremberg laws came into effect, and which said Jewish doctors cannot treat Christian patients. So there went my grandfather's whole practice. So they started making preparations to leave Germany. My grandfather had met 2 Chinese doctors. I don't know if it was at a clinic or at a conference, but this was in 1937 or 1938, before Kristallnacht. He had met these 2 doctors, and they indicated that there was a war between Japan and China, and they needed doctors. Now, my grandfather was on the list to go to the United States, but again, like, who was it? Someone was on a quota list. They had to wait a long time. Yeah, he didn't want to wait. There was a chance that he could have gone to Costa Rica, which would have been very interesting, but he ended up in China. Now, Madeline's family and her mother and father went to Shanghai, because at that time, Shanghai, anyone could enter Shanghai. My grandfather was hired by the Chinese government as the auxiliary for the Chinese Red Cross. So that instead of going to Shanghai, they went to Hong Kong. When they went to Hong Kong, oh, there's another story, sorry. They left in March of 39. They left, I forgot which port they left, it could have been Hamburg. They stopped off in Amsterdam because this was Passover time, and they bought Passover food. They were going through the Mediterranean on their way to China through the Suez Canal. Now, this is a true story. They celebrated Passover Seder on the Red Sea, going from oppressive Germany to freedom in China. They had the Passover Seder in their cabin, and it was but that's very kind of interesting, I thought. So anyway, they made it to China. They got there in April 39. My grandfather already had a job, so everything was fine. In 1939, right? Yeah, and the war started in 39. That's right. Well, they were in a British colony, and they were German, so they were considered enemies. So the British rounded up all the Germans and deported all the Germans, including the German Jews. I think the German Jews may have been sent to Shanghai. My grandfather stayed because he was working for the Chinese government, so he was protected somehow. So they stayed in Hong Kong, but they had their passports stamped friendly enemy alien. Because although they were German, because they were Jewish, they were considered friendly. It said friendly enemy alien. My grandfather's work and the Chinese Red Cross was basically to set up hospitals and to treat the refugees caused by the war between the Japanese and the Chinese. He was stationed in South China. In 1941, when the Japanese occupied Hong Kong and occupied the rest of China, the coast of China, my grandfather was in the interior doing medical relief work, and he was cut off from my father and my grandmother because since he worked for the Chinese government, he was technically an enemy of the Japanese government. So for 4 years, or 3.5 years, they were separated. My grandmother had to fend for herself and take care of my father. There was no schooling going on, and she sold a lot of the family heirlooms to get food on the table. After the war, my grandfather left the Chinese government and set up a private practice in Canton. He was primarily the doctor. There were 2 Western doctors in Canton, of which he was one, and he was a doctor for the consulates in Canton. Now, back to the Torah. This Torah that was in the family, was in a temple in Breslau. By that time, the Torah was housed in a synagogue. Sorry, I'm not used to public speaking. Okay. My grandparents were planning to go to China. The Torah was in the synagogue. My great-grandfather, Leo Zadik, took this 100-year-old Torah out to check to see if it was kosher. We don't know if he had a premonition about Kristallnacht or whether he was checking it to make sure it would be okay to go to China. But nevertheless, he had the Torah when Kristallnacht happened. So all the Torahs all across Germany, many of the Torahs were burned, and the synagogues were burned. But that Torah was saved. We think, I haven't checked, and I will check on it, there were Torahs from Germany that survived the Holocaust. But I do not think there were very many Torahs that stayed in the same family. It's the family Zadik Torah. We are currently in possession of this 165-year-old Torah that we have right now. Yes, it was in our synagogue, and they kind of kicked it out. They didn't have space for it. So I'm going to be talking to Ovid and my sister about. Right now, it's in a special container to preserve it. It's in a special Chinese camphor wood chest to keep it and preserved. Technically, the Torah is not kosher, but because there are some pieces that are a little bit faded. But I used it for my bar mitzvah, and Ovid. I don't know which. Did one of your daughters? I think it was one of your daughters read it also for bat mitzvah.
No, I think it was Danielle, because we came for Danielle's bat mitzvah, and I remember the story that Danielle was going to be reading from this Torah, and so
probably Danielle's. And now this Torah, Miriam's grandson, Alex, and John's, of course. I'm sorry, John. Their son is Alan, and his son, Alex, is going to be bar mitzvahed in March. And he's going to read from the Zadik family Torah for his bar mitzvah. So that's the Torah story. So we took the Torah from Germany to China. After the war, my grandfather stayed in China. When Mao Zedong came to Canton, he kicked out all of the foreigners. But because of my grandfather's work during World War II, setting up hospitals, treating the refugees, he was considered a good white devil. So he was allowed to stay in communist China, and my grandparents stayed in communist China for, I think, 2 or 3 more years. Before this, my father had gone to the United States to attend university at UC Berkeley. In 1952, my grandparents joined my father in San Francisco, bringing with them the Torah. Now, Miriam had said that during the Japanese occupation, or even before the Japanese occupation, my grandmother, Margot Zadik Zellner, had hidden the Torah.
Mao Zedong thought that his grandfather, wife, and kid will go to Israel after leaving China. So he sent a thank you note to Ben-Gurion, who was at the time the Prime Minister of Israel, that about his grandfather thanking him for helping the Chinese cause during the Second World War. Although, as it turned out, he made a left or a right turn and came to the United States.
Because my grandparents were leaving communist China, they were not allowed to go directly to the United States. So my grandparents told the government that they were going to Israel. And that's why they were allowed to leave communist China, and that's why Mao Zedong wrote the letter to Ben-Gurion about thanking them for my grandfather's service during World War II. But
did they have a Chinese passport then? What kind of passport did they have?
you know, I don't know. But somehow, like I say, I don't know what happened. Somehow they were able to make, as Miriam said, a left turn. And instead of going to Israel, they went to the United States. I do have to mention, since I'm the only representative of page 5, Margot's sister, Ruth Zadik Schnell, was kind of a sad story. They were very religious, and in 1939, they were able to get to Israel. And apparently, I think it was some money must have changed hands, because it was very difficult for Jews from Germany to go to Israel. They ended up in Haifa, where a lot of the Zadiks seem to be, and they have one son, and it was really a kind of sad story. I don't want to end on a downer note, but I do have to represent that part of the family too, since no one's there. They had one son who was my father's age, and he got involved with the Jewish freedom, the freedom fighters, the Etzel.
The Lehi was the extreme right of the revisionist party. I don't know how many of you know much about the history of Zionism. Reason for it being called revisionist, everybody was Zionist, but it wasn't the mainstream, it was the revisionist. And Jabotinsky was the leader of it. And the main grouping became the Etzel, or the military part of the revisionist party. But an offshoot was the Lehi. And the son of Ruth Schnell became a member of it. But the story is not, all I got from our mother was basically that he did not obey the orders that he was told. He did something differently, and he was actually killed by the Lehi.
Is it in there?
I don't think that part is written in it, only the part about Siegfried and the parents. At the same time, the father was shot about a year earlier or so by some Arabs, and to revenge him he was fairly badly injured, survived it, the husband of Ruth Schnell. And the next day or so, a bomb was thrown in an Arab shuk nearby, and somebody came to the store and said he was avenged. The third part of the same family that had to do with the Etzel and the Lehi was Siegfried Zadik, which none of the members over here in Israel know about, but you will find him in the book. And he was accused of belonging to the Etzel, which he did, but they never had any real evidence. But in any case, they sent him to Kenya, where most of the prisoners, the Etzel prisoners, were sent to. And through Kenya and Eritrea and Ethiopia, he finally made it back. Yeah, as recently, I guess, as 1981 or 82, the wife of Siegfried Zadik came to La Jolla and stayed with Ruth Zadik. Yeah, Ruth Man Zadik, right? Yeah, right. So the mother of these boys that you're talking about. And so we know they're around. It's a question of tracing them.
Okay, I'll do it real quick about this Ernst Michael Zadik, who belonged to the Lehi. I think he was barely 17 years old. And it was kind of also an adventure for him to belong to a secret group and so forth. But he was very religious. And there was supposed to be some action taken, some assassination of some British. And unfortunately for him, on the Saturday before, יואב, אתה רוצה לשמוע את זה, מפני שזה באמת חלק חשוב. In the synagogue, he decided to talk about the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill, or in Hebrew it says, thou shalt not murder. And they suspected that he would give the whole thing away, that there is going to be some action, and he was murdered by the Lehi. Many years later, I read when they interviewed one of the Lehi commanders that he said that he's not sorry for anything they did against the British, but there was one incident which he is awfully sorry, and it was a mistake. He didn't mention him by name, but when he talked about it in the interview, we all knew he talked about Michael Schnell. His mother was a tzaddik from Shavei Tzion.